you also need to understand the balance of passion, how much people really care about these wars. And good examples are Vietnam and Afghanistan, where in both cases the balance of power was overwhelmingly with the Americans in Vietnam and with the West in Afghanistan, but on both cases the Americans and the West lost. And it's because we didn't care as much. The cause didn't matter as much to people. So we weren't prepared to pay the price. So the balance of passion, I would say, it's sort of equal between the Russians and the Ukrainians, but the rest of us don't care as much.
Right.
The Russians, it's an existential threat. The Russian people think that they're under threat from the West. They've watched NATO advance and advance and advance, and finally they've felt they've had to fight for it. And they also, I think, have the balance of power. So at the moment, the balance of power and the balance of passion overall lie with the Russians, and they'll see that
really
through.
That's a great characterization of that. That's very almost never considered, but that you can see it when you start looking for it. Now, next thing you brought up in the article here, which I also think is hugely important, aside from the industrial capacity, and that is the mobilization capacity of the U.S. Army in particular, because the NATO is not going to fight anything successfully on a level of fighting Russia unless they have the full-on commitment of the United States. But as you wrote, second, to have the remotest chance of success in this doomsday scenario of NATO-Russian war, U.S. forces would need to deploy at a scale into continental Europe, even if the U.S. Army was established at the necessary scale, with a 2023 establishment of 473,000. I think it's down to about 460 something now. Under 1/3 of the current Russian army, the overwhelming majority of American equipment and logistics would have to travel by sea. Why is that a problem?
It's a problem because traveling by sea is vulnerable. And of course, if this were a situation where NATO was at war with Russia, then this isn't about Ukraine. It's about the NATO campaign sphere. And that includes continental USA, it includes all of Europe, and it includes the seas between them. If you look at the Second World War, people don't often realize, but the Americans did something extraordinary, which was to build Liberty ships. I think they built 2,751 Liberty ships. And that was for the logistics and to get this kit and the people across into both the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans. Back in those times, we had a very difficult battle in terms of the submarine threat and indeed mine warfare. At the height of the Cold War, certainly when I was serving, I was an anti-submarine warfare specialist. We had significant anti-submarine warfare forces, and were able to give a very high degree of confidence that we could actually support and make sure that forces that were coming from continental USA to Britain and to other places would be protected. When I last looked, the British forces for anti-submarine warfare were a third of the size that they were in 1986. And when you talk to some of these as well, they're just not getting the training that we used to get. They're not getting the time at sea and the time doing the things you need to do. And it's not just anti-submarine warfare, it's mine warfare as well. So ships are very vulnerable to mines. So to be able to get the logistics across, and don't believe for a second that you can fly it across either. I'm reminded of a story of us wanting in Britain suddenly to put a brigade into I think it was Bosnia. It would have been in about 1993 or 4. And somebody said, why don't we fly it instead? When we looked at the statistics, to fly the brigade would have taken these, I can't remember which of these figure is right, but it would either be 15 or 50 years when you looked at the pallets, all getting the stuff across. So 90% of it will have to come by sea. And so that sea...
And of course, that assumes none of the ships or the airplanes got knocked out either. So
So the, heavy stuff doesn't go well by air, so it's all going to have to come by sea, and at sea it'll be vulnerable. I don't think the Soviet submarine force is as big as it was, but it's still highly effective. And some of the nuclear submarines, they're still very difficult to actually counter, and you need all arms sort of approach at sea to be able to counter them. I see none of the evidence of the experience of that in the British forces, who were the experts.
Right, and just real briefly, I wonder if you could talk just a second about the capabilities and the vulnerabilities of the surface fleet versus the subsurface fleet? Because I perceive that, especially a lot of these sea drones, we've already seen the Black Sea fleet take a lot of damage, that the things that can now hit the surface ships is a lot more vulnerable than things that can hit the subsurface fleets.
Yeah, I think that's closely related to distance from shore. So the closer you are to shore, in an enclosed sea like the Black Sea, then the more vulnerable you are. So I would never, if I was I think we put a destroyer, and I think the Americans put a couple of destroyers up into the Black Sea. If I was a destroyer captain once, I wouldn't like to be up there. I've got very little warning. You've got very little what we call sea room. So sea room means that you're further away and you have more time to react to things. This is the problem that the American carrier battle group, carrier strike group are suffering in the Red Sea at this very moment, which is you've got very little time to react. That doesn't mean to say that you wouldn't want to have those forces, because you can't do everything by submarines either. Yeah, we can't provide logistics by submarines. There's no such thing yet, and it would be extremely expensive. So what you really need to do is to have a sort of, again, it's the sort of all arms equivalent offshore that you and I have talked about onshore. You need to counter submarines, you need helicopters, you need light aircraft carriers, you need your own submarines, you need maritime patrol aircraft, and all of these things, and they've got to be well experienced and working together. And there's very little evidence that we're doing the big operations and the big exercises that we did in the 80s and the 90s to do just this thing and get across to continental Europe from the USA.
Okay, so we have the issue of the mobilization. We have the issue of the logistics and getting at scale, getting things across. Then the issue that you raise here, perhaps more contemporarily important, other than a handful of NATO trainers forward deployed in Ukraine, our forces have trained according to a pre-drone maneuver doctrine and have no real-world experience of modern peer-to-peer attritional warfighting, whereas the Russian army has close to 3 years experience now and is unarguably the world's most battle hardened. Now, that's one of the things that people, I don't think people who haven't been in the military don't get, because they say, no, what are you talking about? We had 20 years of combat experience in Afghanistan. We had another 8 or 12, depending on how you want to count it, in Iraq. I mean, we've got a lot of combat experience here. So how do you say that unarguably that the Russians are the dominant military force right now?
I think what we're talking about here, and you'll know this even better than me, Danny, is we're talking about the distinction between, on the one hand, Afghanistan and Iraq, on the other hand, Russia. This is a great power on its own continent. It's a peer-to-peer fight, and it's a peer-to-peer fight with a power which is now 3 years into to the war, and over the last 30 months has been advancing at a pace that suits its strategy, I think. Nothing to do with people.
Yeah, and actually, let me ask you a question here, because one of the other arguments that I hear a lot, and I mean a lot, even among people who are generally in agreement with, restraint, et cetera, is that, well, actually, the Russian armed forces, they ain't that good. They are arguably not that great, because look how little that they've got in 3+ years of war. So this shows that they haven't gotten any more because they can't. What do you say to that?
I say to that people who are doing that are guessing the strategy, and they're guessing wrong, in my view. I don't know what Russia's strategy is, but I have a reasonably good idea what I think it is, based on what I can see from the actions on the ground. I think you talked about the first 2 years of the war, and it seemed to me that what we were watching after the potential for the Istanbul Accords fell apart, and the Russians realized that with a relatively small force, somewhere between, I think I think the original force that we talked between either, 190,000 or 90,000, and many of which were actually freedom fighters, if you like, from the Donbass, so that they are up against a much larger, at that time, Ukrainian force, which had been trained by Europeans. I think I was surprised when Larry Johnson's figures, I think he talked about a Russian force of about a Ukrainian force of about 800,000. But at the time, it seemed to me as well that when I looked at the size of the force that the Russians put into Ukraine, it was obvious that they weren't there to actually take Ukraine, because I cannot imagine that the Russian General Staff would have expected to take Ukraine with that small a force. It's unbelievable that they would have advised Putin, or that he would have accepted that. So it seemed to me that when the political force, which I think is essentially what it was, even the drive towards Kiev, I think, was largely political. What didn't happen, and they realized they were going to have to fight, then it seemed to me that they withdrew to the Serebrennikov line, and then there they consolidated, and that's when the large expansion began. So, and then they've decided to move forward at a pace which suits them. And I think the last exchange of bodies I heard, we've heard between 1 and 7, with for every one Russian exchange there've been 7, and I've heard up to 15. The last figure I heard was 22 Ukrainians for every one Russian killed, and of course that suits Russia's demilitarization purpose, because if they're killing so many Ukrainians, it's a horrible, horrible thing to say, but there's little better way than to demilitarize a country than to, if it keeps throwing people at you, is than to actually kill its armed forces, the people of its armed forces. No matter how much equipment you've got, you'll find it very, very difficult to remilitarize with the heart of your male population knocked out. So I think there's the people who say this, I hear it time and again. I say to them, so what's Putin's strategy? What's Gerasimov's strategy? They don't know, because they'd have to guess. And I think my view is that we're at the end, I think, of largely a demilitarization phase where they've been moving forward. Now I will watch with interest to see as they start to exploit into areas which provide them with strategic depth.